French cities are in flames over systemic racism. In the sprawling housing projects that ring many French cities, heavily populated by working-class minorities, the rage is rarely far from the surface. Often, for good reason, it is directed at the police. That simmering fury erupted in waves of violence in suburbs and cities across France this week after police shot to death a 17-year-old named Nahel M., from a family of North African origin, in a town just west of Paris. Video of the incident, which went viral almost instantly, showed a policeman opening fire as the boy started to pull away from two motorcycle officers who had stopped his car. Nahel was unarmed. French police discharge their weapons and kill civilians at a fraction of the rate their U.S. counterparts do, and many people in France tend to regard violence and racism by law enforcement as mainly American problems. Many white people in France, that is. Among migrants and their children, most of them from North and Sub-Saharan Africa, hard feelings toward law enforcement have run deep for years, and many regard police bigotry as a symptom of bias in French society generally. In a recent survey of black and mixed-race residents of France, 9 in 10 said they had encountered racial discrimination, and roughly half said they had been stopped and asked for their identification, more than twice the share of the overall population who reported the same thing. In the first months of the pandemic lockdown, a survey by Reuters found that in France's 5 departments with the greatest percentage of immigrants, police issued fines at a rate more than 50% higher than elsewhere in the country. Such routine racial profiling is a quotidian reality for millions of residents who, even if they were born in France or have lived here for decades, often are made to feel not fully French. For years, researchers have documented discrimination in hiring in schools and on the streets. That was the social kindling lit by the death of Nahel on Tuesday, which ignited riots in and around Paris, Marseille and other major cities. France has been set ablaze, cars incinerated, buildings torched, incendiary devices hurled at police in riot gear. Shops and stores have been looted, ATMs demolished, windows smashed. In the first 3 days of violence, nearly 1,000 people were arrested and at least 200 police officers injured. On Friday, Interior Minister Gerald Darmanin said 45,000 police would be deployed to quell the riots around the country. President Emmanuel Macron cut short a trip to Brussels and returned to Paris to address the convulsions on Thursday. Facing calls that he declare a state of emergency, which would trigger curfews and allow authorities to ban protests, he tried to strike a balance between insisting on a return to order and expressing indignation at what he called Nahel's unjustified death. But as Macron surely knows, he has been forced to address symptoms, not causes, of France's inequity, schisms with roots in the country's colonial past that have been papered over for decades by a policy of official colorblindness untethered to real people's lives. Under French law, data collection on race and ethnicity is strictly limited, meaning the government, which, for instance, publishes no information on the racial or ethnic composition of its police, operates in a state of self-imposed ignorance and denial. For minority residents of France, however, the absence of data is irrelevant. Their lived reality is evidence of actual bias, even if Macron has previously asserted there is no systemic racism in the police. This is a moment for the country to seriously address the deep issues of racism and discrimination in law enforcement, UN Human Rights Office spokeswoman Ravina Shamdasani told a media briefing in Geneva. Similarly, anodyne calls for France to grapple with those dilemmas are all too familiar. They were issued with numbing regularity even before the resentments of the country's migrant communities exploded into weeks of anarchy in 2005, after 2 teenagers were electrocuted inside an electrical substation where they had fled following a confrontation with police. It didn't help that the interior minister at the time, Nicolas Sarkozy, who later became president, referred to the rioters, many of them from migrant families, as gangrene and rabble. In that instance, the government declared a state of emergency to contain the crisis after nearly 2 weeks of running street battles between rioters and police, often set against a tableau of flaming cars. The emergency lasted 2 months, enabling the authorities to impose curfews and regain control of the streets. Yet despite the ensuing years of reforms, including programs targeted at the cities and neighborhoods that burned in 2005, the problems still fester. And the police remain reviled by communities they are duty-bound to protect. French cities are in flames over systemic racism. In the sprawling housing projects that ring many French cities, heavily populated by working-class minorities, the rage is rarely far from the surface. Often, for good reason, it is directed at the police. That simmering fury erupted in waves of violence in suburbs and cities across France this week after police shot to death a 17-year-old named Nahel M. from Macron's never-ending dance with despots needs to stop. President Emmanuel Macron stands accused of tyranny by much of the French public, furious that he raised France's retirement age to 64. It's a bizarre claim. In fact, Macron did what he promised to do in his re-election campaign last year. He did it by constitutional means, and even under his reform, most French workers remain younger when they qualify for retirement, at full pension, than in other advanced Western countries. The real problem with Macron's record, and the main danger for his legacy, is not that he is a closet dictator. It is that he has courted, coddled and kowtowed to actual dictators. Worse, he does not seem to learn from those errors, which have provided cover for some of the world's most pitiless autocracies. The short list of tyrants for whom Macron has served as sympathizer or apologist includes Russia's Vladimir Putin, China's Xi Jinping and Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, known as MBS. His motivations appear varied. In Putin's case, the French leader eventually reckoned with the Kremlin despot's neo-imperialist delusions, which should have been apparent much earlier. In each instance, however, Macron's words have been a tonic for bullies and a wedge dividing Western allies at exactly the moment they could least afford disunity. It was telling that NATO's Secretary-General, Jens Stoltenberg, when I interviewed him last month, had harsher words for Macron's pursuit of European strategic autonomy than he did for former President Donald Trump, who repeatedly threatened to destroy the transatlantic alliance by withdrawing the United States. "I believe in strategic solidarity," said the usually circumspect NATO chief. "Because if there's anything we have learned from the war in Ukraine, it's that North America and Europe have to stand together." Few blamed the French leader for his attempts to avert all-out war via personal diplomacy with Putin, with whom he spoke more than a dozen times as Russian troops massed on Ukraine's borders early last year, and even after they invaded. In doing so, he consulted closely with President Biden and other key NATO allies and embraced a realist view that negotiations will be necessary to stop the fighting at some point. But many in the alliance choked when Macron insisted that the West must not humiliate Moscow but rather grant security guarantees to address its supposed fear that Ukraine presents some sort of threat. That mistook the aggressor for the victim, paid homage to Putin's propaganda, and was blind to the Russian dictator's predatory conduct in Chechnya, Syria, Georgia, Africa and elsewhere. He doubled down and further undercut Western solidarity